What if the Big 12 was never formed? This is a Conference Realignment remix. This is a new series of videos that I'll be doing that go back to key points in Conference Realignment history in college football and say, what if this event went slightly differently? What would the alternate timeline look like after that happened? And today we're looking at the formation of the Big 12. In the late 80s, the Southwest Conference was in free fall. They were losing attendance to the Dallas Cowboys and the Houston Oilers. They were embroiled in multiple different recruiting scandals, including the SMU death penalty scandal, and they were among the lowest viewed conferences in the region behind the Big 8 and the SEC, which dominated nationwide viewership for college football. And this all came to a head in 1990 when Arkansas decided to join South Carolina in joining the SEC and making it a 12-team conference. This left the Southwest Conference with only 9 teams, multiple teams that were not carrying their weight, and Texas and Texas A&M needed to find something to do, and fast. So after both schools explored multiple different options, including Texas joining the Pac-10, Texas A&M joining Arkansas in the SEC, or both teams going north to join the Big 8, they eventually landed on combining with Texas Tech and Baylor to make the Big 12, which included all 8 Big 8 members and the 4 Texas schools that were mentioned, starting in 1996. But what if instead of joining forces and creating a new central power in college football, these teams separated and joined the conferences that they were having discussions with prior to the Big 12 formation? This is what it looked like. And as a reminder, we're looking at college football going into the 1996 season. So there's some teams that have not joined the FBS or Division 1A at this point, including Boise State. So first, let's start with the SEC. Both Texas A&M and Oklahoma are going to join Alabama, Arkansas, Auburn, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, LSU, Mississippi State, Ole Miss, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Vanderbilt. I know there's going to be some objections to Oklahoma and Texas not being in the same conference, but we're really paying attention to what was actually happening in 1996. And at the time, the SEC was specifically looking for public universities in small southern cities. Both Texas A&M and Oklahoma fit that bill. And while Texas was in Austin, which is not the city that it is now back in 1996, it still was the state capital and a growing city, one of the biggest college cities in the South. So it wasn't as likely that Texas would just go and join the SEC. And not to mention, most of their conversations at that time were with the Pac-10. So it was less likely that Texas was going to just join Texas A&M and the SEC. It would be more likely that Texas would join another school in joining the Pac-10 at that time. Other than that, I think that this is a really strong group of ads for the SEC, with both Oklahoma and Texas A&M being extremely strong brands and fitting in with what the SEC was looking for at the time. As college football grew with the Bowl Coalition, the Bowl Alliance, and eventually the BCS, which is what all this change is really looking towards. So next, let's look at the Pac-10, and there we're going to have Texas and Colorado joining Arizona, Arizona State, California, Oregon, Oregon State, Stanford, UCLA, USC, Washington, and Washington State. Now, of course, we want to look at what the conferences were looking at in 1996, and the Pac-10 and Pac-12, prior to its dissolution over the last couple of years, was always looking for AAU research universities. Both Texas and Colorado fit into that, not to mention that they were both college football powers in the 90s, with Colorado winning a national championship in 1990. And this is one of the things that held the Pac-10, Pac-12 back in the 2011-2012 conference realignment situation leading up to the 14 playoff, because they wouldn't go after schools like Oklahoma or Oklahoma State because they didn't fit into what the Pac-10 had been up to that point. Now, there's a lot of reasons why the Pac-10 dissolved, that just being one of them. But if this did happen in the 90s, like it almost did, there's definitely a much different view of the Pac would be 12 at that time, because again, they're getting not Colorado of the 2010s, but Colorado of the 90s, when they were a super strong program, still to be in quite a few BCS bowls over the next couple seasons before their eventual fall off. But also Texas, who was a classic program and a program on the rise that would dominate during the BCS era. So this makes the Pac-12 one of the strongest conferences, and although they don't have the same amount of teams as the SEC, and of course they have the weakness of playing in the Pacific time zone, this time they'll get some Central time zone and Mountain time zone as well, they still have the teams that could go head-to-head with the SEC in this realignment. Next, let's look at the Big Ten, who has Nebraska, Iowa State, and Missouri joining with Northwestern, Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan, Michigan State, Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, Purdue, Minnesota, and Indiana. Geographically, these ads make a lot of sense for the Big Ten. And of course, Nebraska did eventually join the conference in 2011, but they were a much better get, much like Colorado in the 90s than they were when they eventually left the conference in the 2010s. So if the Big Ten, who had already added Penn State prior to the 91 season, could have added Nebraska in the mid-90s, they would have gone from what was already probably one of the most powerful college football conferences to almost inarguably the strongest college football conference in the country if they added Nebraska, and of course Iowa State and Missouri being maybe a little bit of filler at the time, but still a 14-team conference with all of those teams in the 90s would have definitely had a lot of power in what was going to change with the national championship becoming the most important thing in college football. So with that said, it's kind of important to kind of go over what the national championship landscape looked like at the time. And this was the Bowl Alliance. This is the second formation of what would eventually become the BCS and of course eventually become the college football playoff. But the problem with the Bowl Alliance is that both the Big Ten and the Pac-10 couldn't participate with their conference champions because they were contractually tied into the Rose Bowl, which was at the time not a part of the Bowl Alliance and not a part of the national championship rotation. So there was a couple times in which an at-large team from the Big Ten participated in the Bowl Alliance. In 97, Penn State played in the Fiesta Bowl, and 98, Ohio State played in the Sugar Bowl, but they were not allowed to participate in the national championship unless they were a non-conference champion that was one or two in the final AP poll leading up to the Bowl Coalition National Championship. It would eventually be rectified, of course, with the BCS coming in 98, and that I think was understood that there would be an additional step to this with media rights kind of changing and national championships becoming more and more important, in being very important that 1 and 2 play in the national championship, which was not a thing prior to the Bowl Coalition, which started in 92. So that kind of colors a lot of these changes, right? And that's obviously a big reason why the Big 12 decided to form, so that both the Southwest Conference and the Big 8 Conference wouldn't be left behind in these negotiations and in this setup to getting into the national championship. So that's an important coloring of the situation in 96, because it was not set in stone like it is today, where the biggest conferences are going to play for the national championship. Even if you're a best team from the biggest conferences, you might not end up in that national championship based on your bowl tie-ins, which go back, 50, 60, 70 years throughout the history of college football. But with that being said, a conference that a lot of people question as a power conference was the Big East. And here we have Army and Navy joining the Big East to be with Virginia Tech, Miami, Florida, Syracuse, West Virginia, Boston College, Rutgers, Temple, and Pitt. This also takes some backstory to understand the Big East, because there was like 30 teams, 20 to 30 teams that were playing as independents through the 80s. Miami and Virginia Tech being two of those teams. And of course, Miami being one of the dominant teams in the 80s and the 90s in college football. Miami joined the Big East when they first started to sponsor football in 91 and won a Bowl Coalition national championship during that time. They were probably maybe the second most dominant team of the 90s with Nebraska. Maybe you could put them on the same line as Florida State during that time. Of course, Florida State was also an independent team that decided to join the ACC, but more on them when we get to the ACC. So this conference was heavily carried by both Miami and Virginia Tech, but mostly Miami at the time. And that carried them through conversations into the Bowl Coalition, into the Bowl Alliance, and eventually into the BCS, which became really questionable when Miami eventually left the conference in 2004, along with Virginia Tech, to go join the ACC. By that time, kind of some of the shine had worn off Miami, so even if they didn't leave, it was going to be kind of questionable about why the Big East has so much negotiating power, which they did eventually lose because they were just not on the same level as everybody else. But at this time, not only was the Big East a power conference, Army and Navy had a little bit more say in what was going on in college football, because it's not the setup that it was. It was not the setup that it is today, which is to say NIL, transfers, all of these things that have kind of moved away from the traditional side of college football. So you could just get kids in there as freshmen, coach them up, and by the time that they're seniors, if they've gone through fucking boot camp, they're going to be pretty dominant on the football field just from a strength and speed standpoint. So this conference is definitely not the strongest, but it's also not an extremely not really a weak conference in 96, especially with Virginia Tech and Miami leading the way. The other conference that we mentioned there was the ACC. And in this scenario, they're going to go ahead and add East Carolina, who had a pretty dominant start to the 90s as a football team. And they're going to join Florida State, Virginia, Clemson, Georgia Tech, North Carolina, Maryland, NC State, Duke, and Wake Forest. So this is a pretty similar core to the ACC that we know today. Of course, like I mentioned, Florida State joined the conference in that 91 season, which was pretty fateful for pulling apart the FBS or Division 1A independents that were performing in college football, because a lot of it was still centered around basketball, with football being a little bit more of a Wild West setup. Now, the whole thing here is that we're moving towards this national championship, which again was not a thing in college football. So Florida State needed to find somewhere to play that would not only help them find media rights deals that would work for them as a program, but that would allow them to compete for a national championship in these Bowl Coalition, Bowl Alliance, BCS setups that were inevitable down the road. So Florida State is obviously carrying this conference. Virginia was a competent football program at the time. Clemson was a competent football program at the time. East Carolina would actually be one of the higher performing college football programs if they were to join the ACC at that time, because they had been doing pretty well as an independent, like I said, through the beginning of the 90s there. So the ACC, like the Big East, goes to 10 teams and at this time was competing in the Bowl Alliance, would be a part of the founding members of the BCS and have their conference champion going into a BCS game when eventually we did get there in 99. But integral to the BCS setup is the idea of the Power Six. And while we lose the Big 12, obviously never formed, and then we lose the Southwest Conference and the Big 8, there is a spot for a Power Six conference. And another conference that was formed in 1996 that pulled some of these independents together, more focused on basketball, but did have a solid presence in college football and kind of had like those teams that eventually got good, that were small, that eventually became, part of the national conversation. It's Conference USA. So while in 96, they only competed with 6 teams, we're actually going to form a little bit different Conference USA, more focused on college football than college basketball. That's going to look like Louisville, Memphis, Tulane, Cincinnati, Southern Miss, Houston, TCU, Kansas, Kansas State, Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, Baylor, and BYU. So I guess in a lot of ways, this is the poor man's Big 12, because it takes the founding members of the Conference USA, which included Louisville, Memphis, Tulane, Cincinnati, and Southern Miss, and Houston, kind of focused around bigger cities in the South and northern South, the high South, I don't know exactly what you call it, and then taking those teams that didn't make it to those bigger conferences from what would eventually become the Big 12, and of course adding in BYU for a little bit of college football power there. Now, this might not be the most powerful conference, but let's put this up against the Big East. Let's put this up against the ACC at the time. Does this hold its own water as a eventual BCS contender, BCS conference, where their champion would be playing in a BCS bowl every single season? I think it does. I think that, of course, Louisville, probably Oklahoma State, Baylor, BYU are some of the college football powers of this, but there are a lot of these schools that are power conference schools today. Of course, really, you're only excluding Memphis, Tulane, and Southern Miss from that at this point. And I think that Memphis and Tulane could both become power conference teams over the next couple seasons, depending on what Conference Realignment has in store for the rest of the 2020s and the early 2030s. Memphis is trying their damnedest to get that anyway. Somehow they have $200 million to buy their way into a conference that no one believes in that they have. But I think that in 96, this conference is put together and they become a BCS or eventual BCS conference with this lineup that we've got together. And while I brought a lot of teams out of independent status in this realignment, one thing I didn't do was put Notre Dame into a conference. And that's because we wanted to do a somewhat realistic realignment remix, which at this time, Notre Dame had already broken college football. They had moved out of the CFA, which was essentially a negotiating body for multiple different conferences under one roof. That, of course, would not last because these conferences were going to get greedy and have different wants. But Notre Dame had already broken out of that as an independent, negotiated a deal with NBC, which still lasted today, obviously much higher value nowadays, but that still lasted today, and had already had a seat at the table with the Bull Coalition and the Bull Alliance, and eventually would have their own seat at the table with the BCS. So why would, if they had that much negotiating power as a single entity, why would they ever go into a conference? And that's true still today. Notre Dame is the only school that has an individual seat at the table with the College Football Playoff Committee. What would ever make them want to lose that in college football? Unless there is some stronger power that comes in that forces teams into conference, Notre Dame will never join a conference in college football. It just does not make any sense. And I don't necessarily think that it really makes sense for anybody else. Of course, Notre Dame has this weird schedule, but they do play tougher teams. Of course, the beginning of the season hasn't been great for them, but that's because they did schedule two, at this point, I think both top 5 teams in Miami and Texas A&M. Now, of course, that is being buoyed by a win against Notre Dame, who hasn't won against anybody else. So how does that, but that's college football for you. You get more money, you get more points for name value than actual win value. So there's no reason in this or any realignment, if you're trying to be realistic, to force Notre Dame into a conference. And that's just, if you look at the history of college football and you look at the history of realignment, and this is kind of the biggest move in modern realignment, the formation of the Big 12. There's also, a couple really big moves in the early 90s with teams moving out of independent status. But Notre Dame has found a way to hold their spot, even though they haven't really been that successful over the last 30 years. There are a lot of other teams that were independent, like Miami, like Florida State, maybe even Penn State. Notre Dame is probably more comparable to Penn State as far as success in that time frame, but Notre Dame has found a way to negotiate their own contracts, to negotiate their own media rights deals, to negotiate their own deals with whatever is the playoff or bowl body, to give them an opportunity that if they perform, no matter what their schedule is, they have a chance to be in the top of the top at the end of the season. And that's just, you have to celebrate it more than anything, because they found a way to do that. I'm not going to do a playoff setup like I usually do, because this is really all built for the eventuality of the BCS, the eventuality of the Big Ten and the Pac-10 not being tied specifically to the Rose Bowl, or the Rose Bowl at least being included in the BCS. So there will be no playoff for that. But I do think that there's a couple things to point out here. In this realignment, regardless of the teams that were added to the Big East and the ACC, they're obviously on a collision course because they are the two smaller conferences, because they don't necessarily have the football powers in abundance at the top that the other conferences have at this point. There is no way that Florida State and Miami can survive carrying these two conferences. So eventually one is going to overtake the other. That's just what is going to happen on this timeline, whether that ends up being the Big East taking in the ACC or vice versa. Maybe the same thing happens where the Big East tries to survive by bringing up smaller teams and they eventually just become a basketball program, which, they are a pretty nice basketball conference at this point. Doesn't necessarily matter to me what would happen, but that's important to point out that there are still on a collision course in this realignment timeline. Conference USA, it's interesting to see if that would survive. I think that, if they didn't have some success early on, you could see those top teams being plucked by the ACC, being plucked by the Big East, which is what did happen in real life. And that's why Conference USA, which at one point was one of the most impressive conferences as far as kind of G5 or non-BCS success outside of maybe the Mountain West, that you could see them being plucked by those other East Coast conferences. But thanks for watching that video. Make sure that you like and subscribe and hype the video if you can. It helps me as a small content creator to get on a leaderboard with other small content creators, and I need all the help I can get. If you made it this far, make sure you leave a comment and let me know what you think. Which of these is your favorite conference? Which do you think is the strongest? And what's another moment in realignment history that you would like me to remix? Leave that in the comments below. If you want to watch more of my videos, I do have those for you. Right here, I've got my popular recent video, which is my Perfect Power 8, which is kind of more focused on the early 90s. So check that one out there. I've got one of my most popular videos here, which is what would college football look like in 2030. So instead of going back, we're going forward. Other than that, I've got my subscribe link on this side here, and we'll check you next time. See ya!